welcome to the UTS Business School Black Lives Matter webinar. Thank you for joining us today. And I think, if you're in Sydney, you've got, wild and windy weather, and where I am, it's pretty wild and windy. I'd like to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging the traditional owners, the first peoples of this country, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Where any of you are, wherever you're located today, you are on the country of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. I'm on the country of the Gumbaynggirr people on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Many of you in Sydney and where our university campus is will be on Gadigal land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So we pause, as we always do, to pay our respects to their ancestors, to the elders today, and to the countrymen and women who take care of this place, the land, the waters, and the people of this country that we all get to call home now. So thank you for joining us once again. This is an incredibly important moment in time, an incredibly important issue for all of us. I'll begin by introducing our panellists, and I'll start with our guests. I'll begin with Jodie. Jodie Bruin is a Yindjibarndi woman from the Pilbara region of Western Australia. She's lived in Sydney for many years and is an award-winning artist as well, an award painter. Jodie's held a number of positions. In Western Australia, she was the Executive Director of Aboriginal Housing and Infrastructure. In New South Wales, she's had a long history of working here as well as Director General of New South Wales Department of Aboriginal Affairs, co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, and most recently as the Chief Executive of the Aboriginal Housing Office in New South Wales, and also Group Executive of Aboriginal Strategies and Outcomes, Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Welcome, Jodie. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Robin.
Phil Lockyer is a Noongar man from Western Australia and is currently Executive Manager of Safer Communities at the insurance company IAG. He was previously at IAG as the Manager of Indigenous Engagement, and before that, Manager of Indigenous Employment at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And there's many things before that, but those are the things that are most relevant for us today. So thank you, Phil, for joining us.
Thank you, Robin.
No worries. Noreen Young is a descendant of First Peoples of the Sydney region. She is formerly CEO of the Diversity Council of Australia, held a consultancy role at PricewaterhouseCoopers Indigenous Consulting, or PIC as we affectionately know it as, and is now Industry Professor at Jumbunna here at UTS, focusing on First Peoples work and rights at work. Hey Noreen, thanks for joining us.
Hey Robin, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And last but not least is our Deputy Dean, Carl Rhodes, who's Professor here at the UTS Business School. Carl's research focuses on ethical and democratic dimensions of the future of work and how this future might be one of shared prosperity. Of special interest in Carl's research is how ethics can come to bear on contemporary businesses so that organisations, especially corporations, might be held to account by citizens and by civil society. The ethics he advocates seek to disturb those taken for granted by cultures and practices that have led to mounting levels of global inequality, employment precarity and exploitative work practice. So thank you, Carl, for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you too.
My pleasure to be here, Robin. Thanks.
So we come together as academics, practitioners, and both to talk about Black Lives Matter, the campaign, the movement, and about what businesses can do in relation to that. Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of the killer of Trayvon Martin in the United States. It focuses on empowering local communities to oppose violence against Black communities. For all of us who are on the line today, I'm sure we recall the awful moment of watching George Floyd's death on our screens. He was killed in front of the world in a gutter in his hometown. As he was dying, he uttered the words that any reasonable person ought to be able to hear and respond to. I can't breathe. Here in Australia, David Dungay Jr. uttered the same words in a prison cell as correctional officers piled onto his body. He also called out dying to other human beings, saying, I can't breathe. And nobody allowed him breath for both of those men. They were refused that incredibly reasonable request of one human being to another. This lethal and so far legal power given to people by the state, supposedly to maintain order, is killing us. And this is an important moment in time for us to come together to talk about what we as individuals, and importantly for us today at UTS Business School, to talk about what businesses can and ought to do at this time. In Australia, the ongoing colonial project is inherently racist and violent, where police and jailers were the arms of the state and remain the arms of the state, and certainly historically were used to shift us off country, to take our children, to lock us up, to bring the trifecta of resisting arrest and offensive language, to lock us up in increasing numbers. They are the site of violence for those of us who are subject to colonisation. They're not the safe place for us in many, many respects. As First Peoples of this country, we bring the experience of indentured labour, of dispossession, of exclusion from the economy to this Black Lives Matter campaign. We push back against the disproportionate use of force against us, against over-policing, against over-incarceration, and the intergenerational impact that this brings to our children, to our families and communities. I'd like to begin to open up by asking Deputy Dean Carl Rhodes to talk about why Black Lives Matters in this business school and to business. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you very much, Robin. Absolutely my privilege to be here today and to support and contribute to this discussion as a non-Indigenous person. I'm actually an immigrant to Australia. My mother's from Finland, my father from the north of England. The question about Black Lives Matter in the business school is a very important question, and one that certainly is not asked enough. And I think first, we need to recognise that Australian universities have long been a part of Australian racism and acknowledge that Indigenous Australians historically have been excluded from education, whether that be through legal means or through cultural means. And, the engagement of Australian universities with Indigenous Australians is very recent. I mean, it was only in 1959 that Margaret Williams-Ware was the first Indigenous Australian to be awarded university diploma. It was in 1966, Margaret Valadian and Charles Perkins were the first Indigenous Australians to be awarded degrees. And the first Indigenous person awarded a PhD was not until 1980. Now, I think the Black Lives Matter movement has served, if we needed one, as a reminder of the continued existence of institutionalized racism in Australian society. And why does it matter to the business school? Well, business schools are not exempt from this. I mean, even on one level, business schools are largely led by white men and women, such as myself, predominantly teach Western forms of knowledge and practice. Indigenous participation at university is significantly lower than average across all disciplines, business being worse than that average. Across the country, if you look at business students, only about 1% of all students are Indigenous. But despite this, if you think, for example, Closing the Gap has identified education, work and workforce participation as central priorities. The Indigenous business sector strategy has kind of highlighted the value and importance of Indigenous business. And as a matter of human rights, education, employment, and business opportunities are central to self-determination. So business schools have a significant potential. And although there are many important activities that business schools do, there is still a significant amount of unrealized potential as to how we can contribute. Now, often business schools get a kind of bad reputation, often imagined somehow as a training schools for corporate white elites, but they are and can be much more than this. And the activism and awareness given by Black Lives Matter is in a sense a call for business schools to support the democratic right of self-determination, and to support and address the unequal distribution of that right in Australian society. So for business schools, it's about Indigenous participation in business education and research, both as students and as teachers and researchers, making Indigenous knowledge and knowledge of Indigenous Australia central to teaching, research and community engagement in business, and also using our platform in public discussions about the role of business in addressing Australia's terrible history of violence and dispossession and the effects of that are still present today. Black Lives Matter is, in this sense, another way that business schools are called to contribute to a fairer and better Australia. And this is an important thing that we should not at all forget ever.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for that. It is a really important issue for across the board for everyone. And yeah, business schools and business have an important role. Just to put some context for those of you who may have come to the Black Lives Matter movement relatively recently, this is an old story. Campaigning against the disproportionate imprisonment and deaths in custody of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has a long history here. There was campaigning and campaigning which finally resulted in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which reported over 30 years ago. It examined 99 deaths, not all the deaths that had occurred, obviously, but it examined a selection of those. It ran a long and extremely rigorous process. It came up with 339 recommendations. And initially, there was quite strong implementation of them, and it was monitored by a national reporting scheme run by the Australian Institute of Criminology. And we did see some change in that time. In those early days, we saw some change in the treatment of people often in cells and more slowly in correctional, in police cells, but more slowly in correctional institutions. And we saw we saw the application more often of imprisonment as a last resort. We saw non-custodial orders more commonly, but that slipped away fairly quickly, and it's continued to slip away. In 2018, there was a review that found that we have really low numbers, that only in the 27 years since 1991, only 14%, because only 14% of those recommendations were mostly implemented and 16% were partially implemented and 6% not at all. We've seen the rates of imprisonment rise. We've seen again also the rates of children in out-of-home care rise, and we know that that is a path to imprisonment. And any of you that watched Stan Grant's program, Four Corners, last night would have heard the young Mundine man, talking about that, his own experience of that. So we experience the violence that the Black Lives Matter addresses in two ways. We experience it in that quiet systemic racism way, where we are taken by police. We end up going in front of judicial processes that make commonly now give us custodial sentences. We see coronial reports that don't understand our history and where we are from. We see this systemic racism in the criminal justice system, this quiet force that gives us disproportionately unfavourable results all the time. Not all the time, a lot of the time at least. The other way we see this violence is in this extreme physical treatment of us. And we can't talk about this with really recognising the treatment of people like Miss Dew in a Western Australian cell, who called out to police for help from physical violence, from the assault she was experiencing at home where her ribs had been broken. Instead of helping her, they slammed her in a cell. As she began getting ill with septicemia from the broken rib, they dragged her by her legs along the ground of that, on the concrete of that police cell twice, took her to hospital. She received no proper treatment from the septicemia she was dying from. As she called out in pain, she was treated with disregard, until she died days later. Mr. Ward, who was put in the back of a paddy wagon and carted for 4 hours in 46 degree air heat, but 57-degree temperature of the metal of the paddy wagon that he was in, with a 600 millilitre bottle of water. 4 hours in the back of that van killed that man. Brutal, inhumane, cruel treatment of Aboriginal people, the kinds of things you would just hope to never hear about, and yet they are commonplace for us. They are our stories. So we've been talking about this, trying to raise the alarm about this, holding royal commissions, campaigning, talking to the United Nations about it for a really long time. And I want to begin by asking Jodie if you have some reflections. I know that you've seen these campaigns for a long time, and have any reflections on what it means now to see Black Lives Matter come to the fore again with this history.
Yeah, hi Robin. So can I begin by paying my respects to all the Aboriginal people who are on this webinar, and pay my respects to elders past and present and to all our ancestors. And if I reflect on the Black Lives Matter, which, you know, as I said, was sort of started in 2013, but as you're mentioning, this goes back many decades, in fact centuries, I think, as Carl pointed to, in terms of colonisation and the impact of colonisation on Aboriginal people in Australia, and the protests against that and the treatment of Aboriginal people goes back decades and centuries as well. So this is not something new. I suppose what I did want to reflect on, so I'm an Injibandi, as Robin mentioned, and so most of my family live in Rhodes. A lot of my family live in Rhodes, which is, you know, to me it's my hometown, but it's also notorious for a whole range of other reasons, one of them being the death of John Pat in 1983. And I suppose the impact of that on the community is one of the things I want to reflect on. It's not just you know, it's something that is deep and lasting and traumatic for many decades. And so in 2017 there was a memorial at Rhodes that was put in place to remember John Pat, and you know, that's decades after his death, but that, you know, does tell you how long, you know, the impact this has in communities and on the family, obviously, but the community more deeply and the community broadly across Australia. And in the work that I do work with a lot of other communities which have had similar experiences in New South Wales. And, you know, it's a fairly common experience that this trauma and of that experience, the memory of that experience, last centuries, last decades, and you know, it is connected up and bound up with the broader treatment of Aboriginal people in Australia. And I suppose when I look at those 339 recommendations, and when I was working in government, I was part of the reporting against that, but they did have a lot of reporting around other underlying matters as well. So there was recommendations around housing and education and health, for instance. It wasn't just around justice and treatment by police. So when you say things haven't changed and they're going backwards, I think there has been some changes, and I point to some really great examples that are going on that have been put in place, like the iCrowd in New South Wales Police, for instance. So there has been some changes, but I think I take your point that there's also been some steps backwards, which I would hope that the Black Lives Matter does put some more attention back on those recommendations, back on the actions we can take in businesses, in universities, in government, to actually, you know, look at those recommendations again and what we have achieved and haven't achieved. I look at the work I'm doing in housing and also more broadly in the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment to, you know, what can we do differently to actually empower communities? What is those deeper systemic changes that are needed? And I like to reflect on some of the things we've all been involved in, like the Black Deaths in Custody Watch Committee, and then I led an Aboriginal visitors scheme in WA as well, which was visiting people in prisons who were feeling vulnerable and could have a visitor come and check on them, an Aboriginal person who was trained to come and check on them. And I look at what we might have lost as well, some of those programs that were put in place and then didn't get refunded, you know, and there's been some excellent programs put in place and then not get refunded. And I really wonder, you know, that we need to actually be looking at what we can do differently across the board, and as I said, across all of those recommendations. I look at this in the broader sense of reconciliation. I think Black Lives Matter has also focused some more attention on that and racism. I look at the work that Adam Goods did about racism as well, and that, you know, you have these peaks and then it sort of filters down, and I hope we can keep going forward. You know, it's sort of like you lose the momentum or you lose the focus on it. And I hope it does change the way we might look at reconciliation plans that are more than just more than about having welcomes to country or in some more employment, but also those deeper actions about truth telling within those businesses and corporates. And I would hope that there's some more thinking about that and some reflection on what we can all do better.
Thanks, Jodie. That's probably, I think that's really important to also pick up that that those programs did make big change, and that it was much broader than just the criminal justice recommendations. Yeah, thank you. And it's a good segue to you, Phil. You've been working in corporates for 10 years, working on ways that they can influence and make change for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I wonder if you could just reflect on your experience over the 10 years and thinking about how that has impacted on systemic racism and also the issues that we're talking about today. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. And kind of referencing Jodie, you know, growing up in Western Australia, you know, I had family who worked on the Royal Commission into Deficit Custody, had an uncle who worked for Aboriginal Legal Service. So it's unfortunate that, you know, we're still talking about these challenges. I think broadly through the Reconciliation Action Program that we can say that there is a lot of support and, you know, there's a lot of action that corporates are taking to make the lives of First Nations people better. So I would say that there is support for Black Lives Matter. I think with a lot of the programs that corporates are engaged in, focus on education, focus on employment, economic enterprise and culture. And we know that all of those elements, all about cultural recognition, Uluru Statement from the Heart, elements like that are really important and really key to the mental and cultural well-being of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, especially young people. But I think in terms of actually addressing specific issues around criminal justice and the engagement that First Nations people have with the criminal justice system, I think very few corporates are engaged in that. At IAG, we committed about 2 years ago for our Indigenous engagement strategy to contribute to lowering the incarceration rate for First Nations people. And we did that because our purpose is around how we make your world a safer place. And we know that through all socio and economic indicators, all the data available, that the lives of First Nations people in this country are less safe than those of, you know, non-Indigenous Australians. And so we wanted to do something that actually addressed what were some of those systematic root causes of social and economic disadvantage and poverty. And, you know, being incarcerated leads to a whole range of really poor negative social and economic outcomes, which, you know, gets you in that cycle. And so we wanted to be able to address some of those systemic changes. And so we've, committed to working on a project in Mount Druitt that engages us working with Justice for Investment in a justice project. I think a lot of corporates don't engage because it is a difficult one to engage with. They don't know what to do, or it's really hard. You know, it's really violent at times. It's not sexy. It's not something you can talk about and throw your brand to. So I think some corporates find that very challenging. But I would hope that with the change that we're seeing in the conversation that we're seeing taking place, many corporates, especially those who have come out, you know, in support of Black Lives Matter, will actually think about, okay, we're doing some great work in education, we're doing some great work in cultural competency and cultural engagement. You know, we're sending our people on some great secondments supporting the capability of First Nations communities. We're supporting the growth of economic enterprise, which corporates have had a great role in. But what can we actually now do that actually addresses some of the systemic changes? I mean, when you have 35% of the adult population in this country imprisoned First Nations people, then that's thousands of individuals who are not going to be having the kind of life, the kind of safety in their life, the kind of opportunities that other people have. And if we don't start addressing issues around incarceration, then we're going to have generations of young people who we're not going to be able to engage in employment and education and growing enterprise. So I would hope that over the next few years that there's an impetus from some of the leading corporates who are engaged in RAP activities broadly, actually look at this topic and think, okay, this is hard, it's difficult, what is it we can do, and where is a location that we can act that is important for us?
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for that. And Noreen, from all your work advocating to corporates on diversity and the research that you've been doing into the work of First Peoples and pay inequity and conditions, do you have any observations about the connections between the historical and present day work and pay conditions and Black Lives Matter? And secondly, what drivers or incentives might there be for corporations engaging in these issues to contribute to the flaws in the criminal justice system? So a bit of a double question there for you, Noreen. Thanks.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners where everybody is today, and Aboriginal people and others of Aboriginal bloodline on the web. I think that the employment market position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people right now, which is not good in comparison to other Australians, is a direct result of exclusion from the education, employment and labour market past 240 years. That was quite deliberate. I think that being, there was, for people who don't understand the history of it, being removed from land and being forced to work on that land, on your own land, without for it, or being put on actions, the indentured labour around domestic servants and people working on stations, the pay inequity, the very direct pay inequity on stations and on large and across the country. It wasn't just confined to the Northern Territory. Well, that's the most modern example. I think one of the issues that people don't understand is that when the then Commission that Northern Territory stopped. Sorry, Robin?
Noreen, thank you. Sorry, I think, could we ask you to just turn your camera off a bit, because we're just getting a bit of, we're losing your sound a bit. And we'd love to hear what you're saying, but we're losing a bit with
so
that.
I should stop my camera?
If you don't mind, but keep talking, but with just,
yeah.
I think, thank you.
Okay, well, I can usually keep talking, okay. Yeah, I know, it's fortunate, really. I think one of the things that a lack of understanding of in this country, the impact, the employment of Aboriginal people, especially men in the Northern Territory, whereby the Arbitration and Conciliation Commission, as it was then, handed down an equal pay decision in 1969, and the employers, instead of paying everybody the same pay, decided to sack everybody, which is an extraordinary thing to do in the spirit of how the conciliation and arbitration system used to work in this country. So we've had a couple of centuries of absolutely treatment, participation in the labour market, and lack of and subsequent lack of inherited wealth, which has led to the position of of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in the labour market right now, which starkly unequal, as we discovered a couple of weeks ago when we started looking at pay equity. If you do an average weekly earnings between Aboriginal men and non-Aboriginal men in this country, and that's the only one we've done thus far, 30%, which goes to the lack of skills, the lack of education, the lack of opportunity in the labour market offered to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men over the last 200 years.
That statistic, Noreen, I think a few people missed it.
In pay, and the average weekly earnings, 30% in the average weekly earnings between Aboriginal men and non-Aboriginal men, and we haven't gone in this country, and we haven't gone to women yet. And the average weekly income of an Aboriginal woman v a non-Aboriginal man might look like. So that's going to be interesting, and woman to woman, light to light, for comparison between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal women. So all of these things have an equal participatory rate in the labour market, particularly at the management and senior executive position, where again, there's scant few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in management and senior executive positions, even in the public service. I can't think of that stat off the top of my head, but even in the federal public service, where you would think that it was important, considered important, that there be Aboriginal people, Indigenous people making roles, there's not. So I think we are in a place where we do really have to take Aboriginal people seriously, and not just from the position that we often see from politicians, which is about jobs, which is about low skill, low pay positions. It's not about retention. It's not about keeping people in careers over a long period. It's election grabbing, headline grabbing, particularly side of politics that's very simplistic and never ever shoots any responsibility for retention, for example, to workplaces or employers. The blame is always on the Aboriginal person for why go quickly, never come from any analysis of what might be wrong with the job services industry, all of those things that make it very difficult to have conversations because it's so biased inherently against Aboriginal people. So in terms, sorry, Robin?
No, I was just going to say, we really are struggling a bit with the sound, but I wonder if you just have any reflections on the drivers or incentives for corporations to engage in contributing to this. What might move organisations in your observation? And we've just got to watch the sound because it does get a bit flawed, Noreen. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. So I think shame and competition has been my observation over many, many years of being an employment practitioner and an Indigenous employment practitioner, and what works is commercial competition. And I think that what Phil's implemented, for example, if that can be emulated across a lot of organisations, commercially there's an understanding what IAG, there will be others follow suit, and it's a branding position for them, and if we can achieve results from that, why not?
Thank you. Thanks, Doreen. That's a good segue, I think, to you, Carl, for this next question. Much of your work draws attention to the tensions between what corporations say about their commitments to ESG or corporate social responsibility and their willingness to or capability to match the rhetoric with actions. Do you have any general observations about the weaknesses and strengths of businesses to make a contribution to this campaign? And you're on mute, sorry.
Rookie error. Thanks, Robin. Now, we have to bear in mind many Australian businesses have made long-term commitments to addressing racism and inequality, particularly through reconciliation action plans, direct engagement with Indigenous communities, many of the things that, for example, Phil was talking about. But if we think about Black Lives Matter, particularly the most recent protests that we're taking to the street around the world that you mentioned in the opening, many corporates around the world were gushing in their support, often making statements like we need to do better, and in some cases making relatively small donations to Black Lives Matter related charities. Now, in a sense, I think this support that we've seen globally from corporates, it's good news in the sense that corporations generally won't make these kind of, brand connections unless the issues are fairly mainstream. So it suggests this form of accepting racism and being prepared to take action against it has become increasingly mainstream. So if you look at the actions of these corporations, for example, to what happened a few years ago when Colin Kaepernick was taking the knee at football games and later became a spokesperson for Nike. And even if you look at the kind of social harassment, social media harassment that he received, in particular from Donald Trump, the reaction to this Black Lives Matter is quite different, not from Trump himself, but from society more generally. So, I mean, that's a sign of mainstreaming, although that's been much less so in Australia. Explicit support for Black Lives Matter has been there in corporate Australia, but it's been largely limited to the retail fashion industry. A sign, perhaps, to borrow Noreen's phrase, that we've not yet had enough shame and competition, and maybe there's still the need to up the ante on that. And across all of this, I think when it comes to these kind of very public statements, corporations are followers, not leaders. You know, using progressive causes such as Black Lives Matter is a matter of supporting brands, or some people call brand activism, often from corporations which have very little history of real commitment. It's like, you know, what some people call ally theatre. The idea that the purpose is to draw attention to the righteousness of the ally rather than to make any real difference. So there is, in a sense, I think, a danger that Black Lives Matter can do the same thing for wealthy corporations without making any necessarily real changes or improvements. So, I mean, Black Lives Matter clearly has drawn attention to institutionalized racism, including how that operates in businesses. But brand-friendly corporate activism, I wouldn't suggest is any real solution, in the sense that we ask the question, how does it contribute to economic empowerment and self-determination by branded companies making fairly self-interested and self-righteous statements? And also the timing of this. I mean, let's see if this corporate activism remains after this current wave of interest. Is this corporate anti-racism going to be just a fad, or is there a real commitment to reconciliation? Bearing in mind, just months ago, Australian corporations were all talking about supporting bushfire relief, and that was the kind of woke corporate cause of the day. But that soon waned with COVID, and again with Black Lives Matter. So I would say, to answer your question directly, I think some of the strengths is that the concerted efforts of real activists, including activists working in corporations over many decades, is becoming mainstreamed. I think that's a sign that the broad support for Black Lives Matter and the protests we've seen show. But also, and it's that activism that needs to be acknowledged as the way we got to this position, a very effective form of politics. The weakness is that this is easily open to abuse as a form of what I read recently called as Black Lives marketing. That's just another way for corporations to exploit social and political causes for their own interests. So I think there's good and bad news that's come with this current wave of corporate interest.
Thanks, Carl. And which brings me also to asking Jodie and then Phil about the specific initiatives, which are not just rhetoric, but are actually, you know, commitments by New South Wales government and also IAG as a corporate to taking action out there on the ground with communities. So I'll begin with Jodie. In your role in the Aboriginal Housing Office, the Aboriginal Housing Office has a really strong record of procurement from businesses in the construction and the service provision that the housing company, this housing office does. It also has a fantastic program of building the actual construction going on in a detention centre, building, and also providing services in a way that is really tailored to Aboriginal communities. Do you want to talk a bit about why the AHO prioritises this kind of way of working?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. I mean, first and foremost, we have a principle about culture being at the centre of everything we do, and that sort of guides a lot of what we work. And internally we have a cultural reference group, if you like, that we take a lot of our projects through, and there's input. It is internal, and we also have a board, as you know, that gives us a lot of guidance about how do we get the best value and how do we make sure we have culture at the centre of everything we do. So that's in a program sense and a delivery sense to clients, but it's also in the outcomes we're seeking through the spending that we have. And so we do a lot of construction right across New South Wales every single year, and upgrade work and installation of solar and all those sorts of things. And what we have been able to do is use Aboriginal participation in construction guidelines, use procurement guidelines, and set bars really high for that Aboriginal participation and employment in our program delivery. And we've been very successful in that. Sometimes it's about doing some nurturing work with small businesses at the beginning. So giving them some small jobs to get started and then building them up and building that capacity. But equally, it's about making sure non-Aboriginal businesses are held to account for their employment and their percentage of Aboriginal employment through their subcontracting. And we do spot checks to make sure that that's actually happening. So it isn't something they can just say, oh, I'm going to do that as part of the contract. They actually have to demonstrate how they're doing this in partnership or how they're actually achieving those outcomes. So that's been really important. And we have some really good news around, Aboriginal installers doing, all of our solar installation on a couple of thousand properties, for instance, using an Aboriginal company that we actually didn't know was Aboriginal, but got the job based on merit going to tender, doing all this roof replacement for us. So some really fantastic outcomes are being achieved there because we set the bar very high, because there is a weighting in the contracts for Aboriginal employment and participation in those contracts. And then looking at innovations through our program, how can we do things differently? So one of our programs, the Gundy program, is run out of a prison, if you like, where the prisoners and the inmates are actually being trained in the construction of the podular units, and that training then gives them more employability when they leave, but they also, it's a connection to community. So those first homes that we were just trialling were put on the ground up at Gadooga, that's right, up at Gadooga. And the community were, they know that that's where they came from, and they know, how many of our mob are actually in prisons are now being trained and being part of that construction process. So there's work on the ground, but there's also the work in prisons as well. And again, that real, I suppose, innovation, trialling something different, holding companies accountable, looking for brilliance and actually heralding that as well. We also have things like the Service Our Way, as you mentioned, which is around empowering families to meet their potential. So working with our most vulnerable tenants, but empowering them to resolve their issues, helping them a little bit on that journey, but it's actually about them taking control and empowering them to do that. So I think there's some really great examples in the work that we do, and what I suppose we can do as quite a small organisation in Aboriginal housing. We can have some of these achievements. I think maybe we're a bit agile, maybe we're close enough to it. We do that, but we do need that critical mass across all of our spending to actually get really, much more impact in communities and a lot more employment. But I did also want to mention about how important it is. I suppose I was just picking up on Noreen's point about shaming competition, because it is a bit of that as well. We can do really well, and we actually promote that. And how can other parts of government do better as well? I think that's really important. And I those points about bigger corporations and what can they do differently. And I think about when I was with Red Cross, and that they actually set a target around reducing incarceration rates for Aboriginal people in Australia. Now, it's not all about Red Cross. They don't have all the levers, but it's what can they do to help achieve that target, and taking it really serious, because it is about that broader societal change. It is about looking at racism. It is about how do we actually put a focus on this wherever we sit to make sure that we're making a difference. And just reinvest in the work of the justice reinvestment sort of movement and empowering communities. I think the work at Burke, where the community is empowered to make those changes. But it is, we can't move away from some of the racism and behaviours that we see in the criminal justice system, but communities need to be empowered to make some changes as well. So I do see a lot of good things happening, but again, it comes down to that critical mass, it comes down to continuing funding, and that all of us have a responsibility to see the sort of society that we want to see in Australia.
Thank you. And a wonderful way to move on to Phil and the work that's going on that IAG has undertaken through its Reconciliation Action Plan to engage in justice reinvestment in Western Sydney. Did you want to tell us a bit about that? And I'm particularly interested in your journey as an Aboriginal man, as kind of, if I can say this, one of the activists that Carl was talking about, which I think we all are, moving change, through large institutions. And if you could tell us a bit about that journey in the institution and what you might be able to say to others who are thinking about trying to make change in their large corporations. So many questions in one, Phil.
Thanks, Robin. I'm not sure if I would refer to myself as an activist. I think more an enabler of how I can, bring the work that corporates are wanting to do and the desire with the knowledge and the connection with communities. And, when I think about the work that some of my Elevate RAP peers do, such as CommBank and Westpac, Herbert Smith Freehills Lendlease, I think, our commitment to working in Indigenous communities is really, really meaningful, really well thought out, really serious. And I wouldn't suggest that it's even remotely theatrical and I think it's really shallow reading to suggest that we're only doing this because of some kind of brand benefit and we see ourselves as activists. I think that most of the companies involved in this work really are doing it from a meaningful place and really are investing a lot in that. And we often invest in programs that government doesn't touch. So I don't think there's anything theatrical about it. I think it's really meaningful. And so the work that we're trying to do in Mount Druitt, in partnership with Justice Reinvestment and in partnership with the local Aboriginal communities, is about how we can lower the engagement that young people have with the criminal justice system there in Mount Druitt. So we've got an existing program that operates in that broader area. So that location for us made sense from a strategic and a program perspective. We didn't just kind of choose it. We know it's a really difficult community to work with. We know that government invests, in a range of different programs that are often not very well targeted in Western Sydney. So we wanted to ensure that we worked with Justice Reinvestment on a program that assesses the viability of a different way in which to address lowering incarceration. So the whole kind of framework around justice reinvestment is, instead of locking someone up, locking a young person up costs over $1,400 a day. There are 55% of all young people in detention in New South Wales are Indigenous. So it's impacting a lot of the lives of young people in New South Wales. So if we know that if we engage young people in a different way, and instead of locking people up and spending that money, but investing in local communities, then that has a better impact because it goes to the root causes of disadvantage, the root causes of why young people are actually engaging in criminal activity to begin with. Also, we have to address the over-policing and the institutional racism that exists in the police institutions to begin with. I think there's something like $23 million in current fine debts in New South Wales because of train or travel related activity. Now that's not broken down into Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but when you consider that Mount Druitt has the highest population of Indigenous people, you have to wonder why these young people got so many, why people in that area have such a high rate of transport fines, which then leads to other fines as we get to adult life, and then you get involved in this cycle. So the work that we're doing with Justice Reinvestment in partnership and led by local Aboriginal people is around identifying whether there's the support from young people, support from the elders, support from the police, support from those local community organisations to actually work together on a framework which addresses these issues differently. This is something that we at IG are going to be involved in for a number of years. It's not something that we're doing for a brand benefit, so we can tell people how great we are. We're doing it because we know that over time, by engaging with young people getting less involved in the criminal justice system, that actually benefits us as an organisation, benefits our brands, and benefits our local community. Because we want to build resilience and we want to build connectedness in local communities. That's a real benefit for us. And I think that, other corporates want to do that as well, but just not engaged in this topic. So I would hope that the Black Lives Matter movement provides an impetus for a lot of corporates to be thinking, okay, what's the next step we can do? For us, strategically and from a purpose perspective, this work really makes sense. Our people are really proud and passionate about the work we're doing in this, and we're in it for the long term and in partnership with the local Aboriginal people in Mount Druitt, who will lead this work and who will ultimately be responsible for its success. And I think that's one of the key elements that we don't get from government. When a corporate goes into a community and does it right, it does it in partnership and listens with Indigenous communities. We're not there to tell them what they should be doing. We're not there to tell them this is the best way to do it, because we know. We're there to listen. We're there to test, to try new things, to adapt, to pivot if we have to. But we want to ensure that these outcomes that we're getting are locally led.
Thank you. I think there are some absolutely fantastic practical lessons in there and principles as well for what works, guidance for what.
Yeah. And can I just say, Robin, sorry, I forgot. I think that second point about being the black fellow in the corporate, can be really, really challenging. And I think it's really can be. You've got to be able to kind of assess what's important for the business. And that's always my priority, what is important for us to achieve. But as an Aboriginal person, I get the opportunity to kind of go, well, you know what, this is actually something we can be engaged in. And I've just been very fortunate that, IG's kind of been brave enough to go, well, okay, let's invest in this. But I appreciate that that's not always the case. But I think we're seeing lots of really awesome young Aboriginal people coming up and engaging and getting employed by corporates who will be leading this work in the future.
Yeah, I think the things that I'm hearing you saying too are about alignment, about being able to think where do our needs and the business needs align, and then also bringing your knowledge of the importance of being there for the long term and engaging with the community, and really it being about a relationship are really important principles. And my observation is that knowledge is growing across, the corporates that you mentioned, and there's a depth of experience going on through this process now. Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I just want to ask Noreen, what kind of initiatives might corporates take to increase their direct impact on these issues that we're talking about, Noreen? Is there anything? I think everybody talked about quite a few things, but was there something you'd like to add?
Sorry, Robin, you just went quiet for 1 minute. What was that at the end? Sorry.
I was just saying that I think people have talked about quite a few of the initiatives that corporates can take and the principles and the characteristics of things that work. But was there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, what I'd like to see this moment as a bit of a turning point story. At Jumbo at the moment, we're doing a survey of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about workplace experiences. I'd like the conversation to be led by Indigenous voices. I think that corporate is best in terms of what Aboriginal employment and Aboriginal employment programs look like. I think there's never, ever been a questioning or a discussion that's led by Indigenous people themselves. And I'd like to see it as a bit like the Black Lives Matter be considered a bit like the Me Too movement has been in terms of sexual harassment. We know that there are varying degrees of inclusion and exclusion of Indigenous workplace to us all the time. an underlying racism. I'd like organisations to be looking at their HR policies and procedures now when it comes to covert and overt bias and racism. Opportunity to really sit down and reflect on what actually happens in workplaces and how hard it can be and how good it can be for Indigenous people working in those workplaces.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm just, again, we're coming close to the end. I wonder, Carl, if thinking about your research and thinking about the example, you know, the positive examples that people have brought today, is there anything you think that we can call out for, you know, taking on board that there are examples where this is just window dressing, but there are also examples where this is deep and meaningful work that challenges corporates, and they are up for you know, we know that some of them are up for the challenge, and government. Anything you think from that could ensure that this is not just window dressing at times?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I think it's important to distinguish the type of corporations that are taking meaningful action, and Phil gave some great examples of that, and to differentiate those for who are just kind of might use social causes for more narrowly minded, self-interested reasons. So I think that distinction is important to make, and also then again, you know, so that corporations can learn from that. I think it's also important to have continued pressure from civil society on both government and business. And if anything, it's the government who's not responding especially well. I mean, at the moment, this continued denial of the brutal realities of Australia's history, denial of Indigenous slavery by Scott Morrison recently is an example of this. And in a sense, you know, business is in the end going to be a barometer of the society in which it is part. So continued activism, continued pressure from society on business is also important, as well as those businesses that are doing this more meaningfully, being, you know, of assistance to others. For many businesses, the support will only come when it's going to align with their business objectives, and obviously, if the general population is supportive of Black Lives Matter, supportive of anti-racism, then businesses will align with this. So it is ultimately a social matter, I think, as much as a corporate one. There has been relatively limited support of Black Lives Matter, specifically within Australian businesses. And I think, in a sense, this might mean that mainstream Australia is still, you know, I mean, while many corporations genuinely pursue racial equality, Australia is not yet to acknowledge the depth of its own racism, or to acknowledge that the wealth and prosperity that we enjoy in this country was built on colonialism, slavery, racial violence, genocide, and the disposition of land. So Australia's wealth and prosperity, in a sense, owes itself to a racist past. And so if reconciliation is about accepting the truth of that history, then this is part of it, especially for business. And this resonates in the present as these structures remain institutionalized. So I think we can hope that the demonstrations and widespread discussions that's the current wave of Black Lives Matter activism has created a positive sign of change, but also a sign that there is much more to do, as well as a sign that there are some corporations who are leading that process.
Thank you, Carl. We're just on the last minute, so I think we're not really going to have an opportunity for questions or for the call out that I was hoping we might be able to ask our panelists to just make a, you know, kind of final summation. So I will take that role. And the thing that I think we've really heard a lot about from people is Again, the importance, and we know this from the Uluru Statement, the importance of truth-telling, the importance of maintaining pressure on government, and we know that businesses are very good at that. They can certainly come together collectively in the interest of Indigenous people, and have done that in the past to bring pressure to bear on government to move for change, to keep bringing that collective momentum that Jodie was talking about, keeping the pressure on and building that. Phil talked about, we need to be in it for the long term, that it is about engagement with Indigenous communities, and it is about self-determination. So with that, it's 2:00. We thank you for attending. Thank you very much to all our panelists. And, we would just hope that we keep going from strength to strength with this Black Lives Matter movement, and that we reduce deaths in custody, and we have greater, and we reduce the systemic racism in this country. Thanks for joining us.